survey, I started keeping track of how many times I hear the word busy. And so I would, be going along and say, hey, how's it going? And I hear a lot of times, busy. Or, how have things been for you? Well, busy. Now, I want to, reassure you, because some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute, I was talking to him last week, and he asked me how I was doing, and now he's singling me out. About half the time that I heard the word busy was coming from my own mouth. So we're all in this thing together, okay? We're all busy, aren't we? We hear that a lot. Busy, busy, busy. During this season of year, maybe we hear it even more than any other time of year. I'm not sure. We do hear it a lot to be busy with people, friends, family, planning activities, planning Christmas parties, Christmas celebrations, family outings. Busy. This season of Advent, I want us to find rest. Now, that doesn't mean we stop all the activity. It doesn't mean we stop the planning and the get-togethers and celebrations. No, you still do all of that. But I want our worship services this month, leading up to Christmas, I want them to be a time of rest. And not just to sort of sit back and do nothing kind of rest, but the kind of rest that comes when we hear and remember and trust the promises of God. Hearing and remembering and trusting the promises of God. You see, we find the rest that we are so hungry for when we not only know what the promises of God are, but when we are able to trust them. To trust them. And I think this time of year, not only are we busy, but I think that need for rest is probably greater than any other time of year. See, if Christmas itself, the Christmas season, if it doesn't actually cause the stress for us, it can certainly bring some of that stress to the surface. Let me explain what I mean. Finances can be a real stressor for people. Right? Maybe money has been tight this year, for whatever reason. Maybe you've had unexpected bills, or had to do a car repair that cost more than you expected, or maybe there's been a loss of income or something like that. And so financial stress, maybe it's been kind of an issue for a while. And now, this season, there's a lot of pressure to buy more stuff and to get the latest gadgets and toys for family and loved ones, right? So the stress has always kind of been there, but now this season of the year tends to bring it to the surface. Or if relationships have been an issue, maybe there's just some tension between you and your husband or your wife or a member of your family, and that tension just kind of always been there. Well, when you have the family get-togethers, you're all sitting down at a table together, that pressure comes to the surface. That tension, that conflict can be brought right to the surface. And sometimes the broken relationships and the pain and the hurt that goes along with all of that becomes more evident during this time of year. Grief is another example. This might be the first time of year that you're celebrating Christmas without someone close to you. And you always miss them. You never stop, but when you sit down at that table and there's an empty chair, you feel the pain much more acute. It just sort of brings it out. So that need for rest, the need for peace, the need for God's presence becomes much clearer during this time of year. How can we find that rest? How can we find that peace that really only God can give us? How can we find that relief from the pressures and from the pains, the worries, the anxieties of life? That's what I want us to reflect on. The prophet Isaiah is ministering to a people who, their situation was in many ways very different from ours, but they were people faced with an incredible amount of anxiety and stress and worry and fear. Now, I think we need to just do a little historical background, especially if we're going to be spending about 3 more weeks, 4 weeks altogether, I guess, in the book of Isaiah. Let's just make sure we understand what's going on when Isaiah the prophet wrote these words. I have a little map up here, because Here's the thing. We're talking about the people of Judah. Isaiah is written to the people of Judah. And if you read the Old Testament, they're always talking about Israel, 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 the Israelites. And then all of a sudden you get the people of Judah, and you're wondering, where do the people of Judah fit in? Who are they? You can see on the map, the purple is the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. And once upon a time, the kingdom of Israel and Judah were one nation. They were the Israelites. And then there was a period of civil war and fighting, and eventually the one nation split into two. You have the kingdom on the north, which was Israel, and then the kingdom to the south, which is Judah. And you can just see in the map that Jerusalem is the capital city of Judah. And so Isaiah the prophet is speaking to people in Judah, in the southern kingdom, during a time of great tension and great conflict. What happened was the northern kingdom all used to be friends with the southern kingdom, but not anymore. They're at war. They don't like each other. The northern kingdom has made friends with a bunch of other nations. And they decided to invade the southern kingdom. And you read a little bit about that. You kind of heard that in our text this morning. They said, we're going to band together. We're going to plow through the countryside of Judah. And if we can capture the capital city of Jerusalem, then we will own the whole land. It will all be ours. Well, things didn't go quite according to plan. They were able to move through the countryside and take all the little towns and the villages. But then by the time they got to Jerusalem, the capital city, they realized they didn't have the manpower to take it. They had to stop. And they had to wait for reinforcements, and they had to wait for more army people, more soldiers, more artillery. And then when they kind of got that all together, then they could go in and raid and take over the city of Jerusalem. So here's what's going on. People of Jerusalem are looking out their windows every morning, and what do they see? Nothing but artillery, soldiers, horses, chariots. And they know that it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of maybe weeks, maybe a couple of months. And the backup forces are going to come, and they're going to move in and take over the city of Jerusalem. And they know that when that happens, they're all going to be either killed or captured, and the city will be plowed to the ground. So you read a great description in verse 2, the second part of verse 2. Here's the mood among the people. The hearts of Ahaz, that's the king of Judah, and his people are shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Now that's as good a description of worry and anxiety as I've ever heard. Fear, trembling, uncertainty, worry. Will today be the day that our city is taken over? Tomorrow, will we wake up, will we be slaves of another nation? Will we wake up dead tomorrow? Will we be killed? Fear. They're quaking with fear. And into all of that, fear and worry and anxiety, God sends the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is sent to the king of Judah, Ahaz. Ahaz is a young king. He's in his early 20s when this takes place. And the responsibility for protecting the city of Jerusalem is all on his shoulders, so you can feel the burden on him. And God comes to Ahaz with a message. He says, if you look in verse 4, here's the essence of the message. Be careful. Keep calm. Don't be afraid. Don't lose heart. Now, those are comforting words if I've ever heard them. Careful. Keep calm. Don't be afraid. Don't lose heart. Here's Ahaz. He's terrified that his people are going to be completely wiped out. And God offers this beautiful promise. Beautiful words. Be careful. Be quiet, some translations put. Keep quiet. Be quiet. Don't be afraid. Don't lose heart. It's going to be okay. And then Isaiah goes on, and he explains why it's going to be okay. Verses 5 through 9 detail what God is promising will happen. He's saying, these people, they look big and strong. They look like blazing bonfire today, but God says they're really just a smoldering log in the fire. They're not nearly as powerful as you think. They're not going to take you over. God is saying, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to set you free. I'm not going to let them triumph. Be careful. Be quiet. Don't be afraid. Don't lose heart. And I think God says the same to us today. Into whatever our situations may be. Whether it's uncertainty about the future, whether it's worry over a loved one, illness maybe, disease, sickness, loss, grief, financial worry, financial stress, broken relationships. Whatever it is, God says, be careful, be quiet, don't lose heart, don't be afraid. He says that to us. He wants to reassure us with those comforting, soothing, gospel-filled words. Be careful. Be quiet. Don't be afraid. Don't lose heart. The enemy, whatever it is not going to triumph. It's not going to win. And all we have to do is trust. And that is never as easy as it sounds, is it? It's never as easy as it sounds. Trust God, we say. But we all know that is sometimes very difficult to do. And I want you to know that Ahaz, this king that God is making this promise to, Ahaz had a very difficult time trusting as well. You look at verse 9. Actually, look at the second part of verse 9. Chapter 7, verse 9. God says, "If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all." That's a $1 million phrase right there, because God is saying, here is the promise that I'm making to you. I will set you free. I will deliver you. But you need to trust me. You need to trust what I am doing. And that was so hard for Ahaz to do, and I'll tell you why. We don't have the details here in this passage, but in another place in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings, we find out that Ahaz has already been at work trying to figure out a solution to his problem. He's made some calls to some generals, other nations, and he's explained his problem, and he said, now come and help me. Send your armies, send your military, wipe these enemies of mine off the face of the earth, rescue me. And so the wheels are already turning, the wheels are in motion for Ahaz to work out this solution to his problem, to work out his own solution to the problem. And now what Isaiah is saying is, God is making you this promise to rescue you and to protect you, but you have to trust Him. You need to get back on the phone and call up those other generals and tell them to put the whole plan on hold because you're going with God's plan. Now what a dilemma from a human point of view, right? Do you go with what is uncertain or with what is unknown? Do you go with what Isaiah is saying? You don't know what that's going to look like. You don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know how God's going to work this out. You just have to trust what He's saying. Or do you go with what you've got in your hand already? Do you say, well, no, I'm going to go with the plans that I've already started making. I'm going to trust myself. There's a warning attached to that. Even God says, if you don't stand firm in your faith, in other words, if you don't believe this promise that I'm making to you, then you're not going to stand at all, and the results, says God, will be catastrophic. Trust yourself. Trust your own plans. Trust your own way of doing things, and it's going to ruin you. Trust God, and you will stand firm. Now, I got to wondering about that, and I started reflecting and realizing that so often one of the reasons we deal with so much stress and worry and anxiety is because on some level we're actually trusting ourselves, our own way of doing things. And let me explain what I mean, and I'll tell it maybe from a personal point of view, from a personal experience. I had some opportunity this past year just to reflect personally on what do I worry about? What causes me stress? And it wasn't a huge revelation to me, but I'm the sort of person that likes things planned out and structured, and I like to know the timing of things, and I like to be kind of in control of everything. Am I the only one that's like that? No, the people laughing are just like that too. You know what it's like. We like to be in control. And when something happens that is outside of our control, or when there's some uncertainty, when there's some unknown, when the timing seems off, Isn't it true that you begin to get worried, you begin to get stressed, you get frustrated? And I've realized from my own personal experience that I'm trusting in myself, how I think things should be. And I'm not trusting in God, who says, I'm in control. Let me manage things. Let me be in charge. Let me set the time. Trusting in myself, not trusting in God. Why do some of us overschedule ourselves? Why do some of us find ourselves so overwhelmingly busy? Right? We fill our lives with so many things, so many activities, so much work. And it's a burden, and it feels sometimes like it's crushing us. And I wonder if sometimes we're trusting in our own measurement of ourselves. In other words, we measure ourselves by what we accomplish, by what we succeed at, by what we produce. We feel really, really good if we're always doing something. And I wonder if at some level that's not trusting what God says about who we are. God doesn't measure us by what we do. Do we trust that all the time? Sometimes I don't think we do. Some of us have a really hard time saying no. Right? We know that we can't squeeze another thing into our life. And then someone calls us up, sends an email, and says, hey, I need you to help with this. And then we're stuck because we know we can't really do it, but we also have this terrible fear that if we say no, they might think less of us. We might lose their approval, admiration, affection, whatever you want to call it. On some level, have we forgotten to trust what God says about who we are? Have we forgotten to trust in God's assessment of us? See, that often lies at the root of this worry, this anxiety, this fear, this stress that we carry. And so the key is then, the key to rest, the key to this soul-satisfying rest is learning to trust the promises of God. Learning to rest in the promises that God gives to us. And what does God promise us? Well, there are a whole lot of things. I'm going to go through the whole Bible and count many, many, many promises, but here are a couple of key foundational promises that God makes. He promises to us that we are His children, and that He watches over us, and that He is caring for us, and that He will provide for us everything that we need. Now, think what it could be if you could trust that and rest in that, and know that sometimes your life is going to spin out of control, things are going to happen that you have no say over, the timing is going to be wrong, but you say, God is still in control. He's got all of this. You see the sense of rest that would begin to follow? Our family's been working through this little devotional book, and this past week there was a really poignant little devotion that we read, and it starts off by asking, and it's written to 8, 9, 10-year-old kids, do you worry? And then it was some of the things you might worry about, and then it asks the question, now how do you fix that worry? And it says you can do one of two things. You can either listen to yourself or talk to yourself. That was clever, so I kept reading. Listen to yourself means you listen to all the things that you have to worry about, and all the stresses, and all the things wrong, and all the things out of your... But talking to yourself is reminding yourself of God's promises to you. Reminding yourself that God is in control, that God cares for you, that God is watching over you. Now, I thought that was just as good for adults as it was for kids, so I'm giving it to you. You either listen to yourself or you talk to yourself. You remember the promises of God. Now, again, I know that sometimes it's still easier said than done, but God gives us assurance. He gives us a guarantee. He's speaking to Ahaz, and one of the things that he says to Ahaz is, paraphrase, he says, Ahaz, I know this is hard to believe, so I'll give you a sign. I'll give you a guarantee. Now, wouldn't you just love that, to hear that from God, that, hey, ask anything and I'll give it to you, and that will be your guarantee, right? That's what God is saying to Ahaz. Anything you want, ask for it, verses 10 through 12. and I'll give it to you. And when you see that sign, you will know that what I'm saying to you is true. And you know what Ahaz did? He turned it down. He said, thanks. In fact, he even uses this pious-sounding language. He says, I can't put the Lord God to the test. You're not supposed to do that. And in a way, he was right. The Bible says don't put the Lord to the test. But when the Lord invites you to ask for a sign, you can ask for a sign. But I'll tell you the reason why. Ahaz is acting very pious and spiritual, but really underneath, Ahaz knows that if he asks God for the sign, then he is committing himself to God's plan. And remember, he had already made his own plans. So he knows that if he asks God for a sign, then he's got to abandon all those other plans, and he's got to go along and trust God. And Ahaz wasn't willing to do it. Makes it sound very religious, very pious. I can't put the Lord to the test. But deep down he's saying, I don't want to trust what God is doing. I don't want to trust God's plan. I want to trust my own. So then God speaks again. And he says, Ahaz, you're trying my patience. You're trying the patience of other people, but now you're starting to try my patience. And furthermore, Ahaz, I'm going to give you the sign. I'm going to give you the sign that you wouldn't ask for. But now the sign that I will give you will not be a sign of encouragement and strength, but it will be a reminder that you doubted my promise. And in verses 13 through 17, Isaiah describes the sign. He says to Ahaz, in your kingdom a child will be born. And this child will be named Emmanuel. And when this child is born, and when the birth announcement goes out, and everybody says, hey, look, a little baby, his name is Emmanuel, then Ahaz, you will remember that you doubted me. And furthermore, God says, when this child grows up, as he begins to toddle around the palace and begins to eat food, and as he grows and matures, then by the time, before this child is old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, then your enemies are going to come in and destroy the land. You can read what God says would happen in verses 15 through 18. God says the enemies, the Assyrians, will lay this land to waste. Thorns and briars will grow up instead of a vineyard. The people you'll be taken away. You'll be publicly humiliated. Why? All because you didn't trust my promise. All because you didn't trust the promise. And that child will be born, Emmanuel. Forever from that point on, Ahaz and all the people would remember they didn't trust. They went their own way. They did their own thing. And so God sent desolation upon the land. But you know, that's not the end of the story. There's more. Because in time, God would send another sign. Another child. And this child would also be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. So this child, Matthew tells us, of course, that this child was Jesus. Jesus would be called Emmanuel. But this child, when this child was born, it wouldn't be a sign of God's judgment upon the people. It would be a sign that confirms God's presence with his people, even when his people failed to trust. And this child, Emmanuel, this little baby named God with us, would grow up, and you know the story. When he was 33 years old, this child, this God with us, this sign of God's presence with his people, would be crucified. He would be hung up on the cross. The nails would be pounded through his hands and through his feet. And this child named God with us, would experience what it was like to have God turn his back on him. Emmanuel, God with us, losing the presence of God, losing the face of God in that moment of darkness on the cross. And why? Well, the judgment that once fell in part on Israel, the desolation, the curse that fell on Israel for their lack of belief, would now fall upon the child, Emmanuel. Jesus experienced that curse, that desolation, so that God could keep his promise to us, so that God could remain faithful to us, so that God will never leave us, so that he will never abandon us. God abandoned Jesus in that moment on the cross so that he would never forsake us, so that he will keep that promise to you and to me. I will be with you. And that really is the answer to our deepest fears and worries and anxieties and pain and brokenness, isn't it? To know that no matter what you are facing, whatever you are going through, God still says, I'm with you. Life may not always be easy. There are things that are going to happen that hurt, that cause you some worry, some uncertainty, but trust and believe that I am with you. I am with you so much that I will go all the way to the cross for you. God is so serious about keeping his promise to be with us that he would rather die in our place than cut us off forever. God guarantees his promise to us. Now, I want you to remember that and to take that to heart in the next week, month, year, especially this season of the year when the stress and anxiety does come to the surface more often, and sometimes that pain is all the more evident. I want you to remember and draw upon the strength of that promise. God is with you. God is with you. God is with you. Emmanuel. You know, when we first moved here back in 2006, that was our first Christmas here. And first December. And you may remember the story, there were 4 climbers on Mount Hood that got lost. And for days the search went on and they were looking, and then the weather got really bad, so they had to stop searching, and then they could search again. And so there was this roller coaster of hope that maybe we'll find these guys, and then ultimately it turned out, no, they realized they would never find them. And that was all going on around the time of Christmas. And I remember it pretty vividly because at one point they did an interview with one of the widows, one of the wives whose husband had died in that climbing accident. And she was a believer, and she said this when she was being interviewed. She says, this was, I think, the day before Christmas, she said, a little child born in a manger is the reason that we have hope today. In that darkest place of death and grief and loss, she claimed that promise. God is with us. We can claim that promise too. We can rest in that promise. God is with us. Let's pray. Lord our God, amidst the busyness of this time of year, amidst some of the pain that is more evident at this time of year, some of the stress, some of the worry, remind us again and again that you are with us. You are watching over us. You are taking care of us. And because of what Jesus has done, you will never leave us, and you will never forsake us. Help us to rest in that promise. In Jesus' name.